The doorway is no taller than any other door in the house. You step through it on a hot afternoon, the same way you have 1,000 times. And the room on the far side lifts away from you, upward, the way no room built in your lifetime ever does. The air has somewhere to go above your head. The heat of the day is up there, gathered against the high plaster, held off the floor where you are standing, and the space around you reads as cooler. A full second before any thermometer would agree. You have walked into rooms like this your whole life. You felt the difference in your body long before anyone handed you a word for it. If your house went up before the war, you already know the room I mean. Maybe it was your grandparents' house. You can still picture standing in it as a child. The ceiling so far overhead, it seemed to belong to a larger, older world than the one outside. And if every ceiling you have ever lived under sat flat at 8 feet, stay with me anyway. The room you don't have is the one that explains the room you do. For most of your life, that high ceiling has been described to you as a problem. Too tall to heat, money leaking upward through every winter. Square footage stacked above your head, doing nothing but collecting dust along the crown molding. Every contractor who ever walked the house told you a version of the same thing. One walked you through dropping it to a flat 8. Another sketched a tray ceiling to make all that volume look intentional. A third called it a heating liability to your face. The truth runs the other direction entirely. That height was never about looking grand. It was the top of a machine built to cool the house you live in, and the men who told you to lower it had no idea what it did. Before we go further, I want one thing from you. Did you grow up in a house where nobody slept upstairs in July, where the whole family drifted down to the cool front rooms by the middle of summer? Put it in the comments. I read them. Subscribe to the floor plan and I will walk you through the rest of what your house has been doing all these years without ever asking you. Start with the numbers because the memory is right and the record backs it up. Through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, the ordinary middle-class American home was built with ceilings of 10, 11, sometimes 12 feet. 10 feet was the plain working standard in residential construction before 1940. Then it fell. After the war, the standard ceiling dropped to 8 feet, and the legal minimum in a habitable room sits at 7 feet to this day under the residential code. That drop had nothing to do with taste. A sheet of drywall is 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, and a single panel, stood on end, covers an 8-foot wall with no cut and nothing wasted. The ceiling height of nearly every house built after the war was set by the dimensions of a drywall sheet and the speed of a framing crew. Underneath those tall old rooms sat the other half of the system, earth that holds a steady 50 to 55 degrees year-round once you get below the frost line. Closer to 48 in Minnesota soil, the same constant ground temperature that kept the basement cold without a wire running to it. Fewer than 1 in 10 American homes had any kind of mechanical cooling in 1950. Today, that figure is 87%. Only in the 1990s did the ceiling start climbing back, and 9 feet is the standard in new construction now, a quiet admission, 2 generations late, that 8 was never quite enough. The house used to do the work. Then a machine took the job, and the height that did it quietly became something to apologize for. The height was real, but the height on its own cooled nothing. What mattered was where 10 feet of room put the heat, and that is the part no one ever explained to you. Hot air rises. That is the entire foundation, and a child understands it. Warm air weighs less than cool air. So on a still summer afternoon, the hottest air in any room climbs and pools against the ceiling. In a room with a 10-foot ceiling, that pocket of heat collects 4, 5, 6 feet above where your head actually is. You live in the lower half of the room. The heat lives in the upper half, parked out of reach of your body. Drop that same ceiling to 8 feet, and the heat has nowhere left to go but down onto you. The hot layer and the living layer become one layer. On the identical July afternoon, the air at standing height in the tall room is genuinely cooler than the air at standing height in the low one. Same sun, same walls, same town. Different ceiling. That difference is not subtle once the afternoon peaks. The few feet of dead, superheated air trapped overhead is the whole margin between a room you can sit in and a room you abandon by 2 o'clock. Builders worked from a habit, not a formula. They built tall because the men who trained them built tall, passed hand to hand the way a recipe moves through a family, and every one of them had stood sweating in a low room in August and understood exactly why you didn't. That tall ceiling was never working alone. It was the exhaust end of the entire house. Down at the bottom, the basement floor sat against earth at 55 degrees and fed a steady supply of cool, heavy air into the base of the building. Above the interior doors, small panes called transom windows let that air slide from room to room without anyone opening a wall to the heat outside. A door left open and a transom cracked above it turned 5 separate rooms into one connected airway. The cool air came in low, drifted through the rooms, warmed as it went, climbed, and gathered up under those high ceilings, and from there it pushed out through the attic and the gable vents at the very peak. The house drew cold air up out of the ground and breathed the heat out through the roof. Intake at the bottom, exhaust at the peak, and the tall rooms in between, giving the heat the headroom it needed to make the trip. The high ceiling was the chamber where the day's heat could rise and wait before it left the building. If you watched the story of the basement floor and wondered why the air kept climbing once it reached the first floor, here is your answer. The ceiling height was the reason the heat had room to rise at all. None of it ran on electricity. The only engine was the weight difference between cool air at the floor and warm air at the ceiling, and the extra height gave that difference the room it needed to actually move. Every inch of that was deliberate, carried through the trades for 100 years, which makes the next fact the hard one to explain. The ceiling over a house built in 1975 sits a full 2 feet lower. The answer begins in 1947 in a potato field on Long Island. That year, a builder named William Levitt started raising houses on an assembly line, thousands of them, fast, identical, priced for a returning soldier holding a brand new mortgage. Levittown opened in 1947, and across the next decade, tens of thousands of subdivisions went up in its image all over the country. The entire model ran on speed, and speed could not stand the basement. Digging a foundation deep enough to reach stable earth took time, crews, and money no production builder wanted to spend. A concrete slab poured flat on the open ground took a single crew a single day. So the slab won. A slab sits on top of the soil instead of down inside it. It never touches the steady 55-degree earth. There is no cool air column underneath the house to feed anything above it. At nearly the same moment, the cooling machine itself arrived for ordinary people. The first modern AIR conditioning had been invented back in 1902, and not to cool a home. Willis Carrier built it to pull moisture out of the air at a Brooklyn printing plant where summer humidity was wrinkling the paper. The whole industry that eventually chilled American bedrooms grew out of a machine designed for a factory floor. In 1947, a window unit cheap enough for a regular household finally reached the market. 43,000 of them sold that first year. By the late 1960s, a new house came with central air the way it came with a front door. Once a machine made the cold, the tall ceiling had no job left to perform. A 10-foot room simply meant more air for the new compressor to chill and a larger volume to pay for every single month. So builders shaved the ceiling to 8 feet because the drywall fit clean and the framing went faster, and almost nobody left alive remembered there had ever been a reason for the missing 2 feet. Here is the part that should sit heavy on you. No one ever announced this. There was no committee that voted to end the tall ceiling or shut down the cool basement. The reasoning lived in the hands of the carpenters who framed those houses, men who knew which way to face a vent and why the foundation wall was left bare against the soil. That generation worked through the 1950s, retired through the 1960s and 1970s, and carried the understanding out the door with them. The men who replaced them learned to size ductwork instead. The knowledge was never overruled or argued down. It went silent, the way a language dies when its last speakers pass on and the people who come after never learn that a word is missing. What disappeared was not the houses. The old houses are still standing, the system still built right into them. The thing that vanished was the memory of what the rooms were ever for. Sit with that for a moment. Which part lands harder for you, that the old house actually worked, or that we stopped building it and no one thought to write down why? The men who knew are gone. But in the houses raised before 1955, the height never stopped working, and neither did the strange little habits that ran it. The tall ceilings your neighbors call dated have been doing real thermal work the entire time. Every quote to drop a ceiling, box in a soffit, or reclaim that wasted upper volume was advice from someone who never once knew the room was engineered. And the people who actually lived in these houses operated the whole system without ever hearing a single technical word for it. Think about the habits in your own family that seemed odd or arbitrary at the time. Nobody slept upstairs in the deep of summer. The whole household migrated down to the front rooms and the parlor as July came on. That was not a quirk of preference. The upstairs trapped the day's risen heat, and the tall main floor rooms held that heat stacked high above the living space, so the coolest place in the house was down and low, which is exactly where everyone went. The back bedroom on the top floor got closed up and abandoned by the middle of June. Shutting that door was heat management, sealing off the hottest pocket in the house instead of standing there fighting it. The little windows set above the bedroom doors stayed propped open all season long. Those transoms were the indoor channel that let air bleed between the rooms and climb toward the top of the house, keeping the whole loop in motion. A single heavy paddle fan turned slow near the ceiling, never fast. Run gently, it nudged the gathered heat along the path it already wanted to travel, doubling the airflow through the house without a furnace or a compressor anywhere in the picture. None of those were superstitions handed down for reasons no one could name. They were the operating instructions for a passive cooling system, followed faithfully by people who had absorbed every move from a parent and never said the word stratification out loud in their lives. A house built on a slab with 8-foot ceilings cannot run any of this. Not a weaker version of it. None of it, because the architecture the system needs simply isn't there. No cold earth against the house, and no tall vertical path for the heat to climb and leave. Post-war construction stripped out both in one design decision, and no renovation puts them back into a house that was never dug into the ground. The proof that this was real engineering is being built right now on the other side of the world. The passive house movement that began in Germany in the 1990s, now written into building codes across Northern Europe, has spent 30 years reconstructing this exact set of principles from first principles: earth-coupled mass, controlled airflow, heat that rises and exits on its own. They did not invent it. Searching for the most efficient way to cool a building, they arrived right back at what a Minneapolis carpenter knew by heart in 1922. So walk back into that tall room on the next hot afternoon. Step through the ordinary doorway into the space that lifts away above your head, the one you have felt your whole life without a name for it. The heat is still climbing off the floor toward that high ceiling, the way it has every summer since the house was built, whether or not a single person inside ever knew to thank it. The system is still in there. Only the people who could name it ever left. Here is the one thing I cannot tell you from where I sit. Whether your ceiling is tall enough and your house deep enough into the ground for the whole loop to still close the way it did 100 years ago. That depends on your rooms, your foundation, and the vents somebody may have sealed shut in 1985. What I can tell you is that the height was never the mistake you were told it was. Look up the next time you stand under it. Then tell me what your house is, the year it went up, the town it stands in, how tall the front room rises, and whether the air up there still feels like it is doing something. If this is the kind of thing you want to understand about the house you actually live in, subscribe to the floor plan.